Good morning. We come to Daniel chapter 6 today, and our title is Faithfulness and Lions. If you open the passage and have it in front of you, you'll see that the action in the chapter begins with an instruction to worship the king. And if you skip down to verse 26, it ends with an instruction to revere the God of Daniel. In between, we're told that King Darius wants Daniel promoted, but the other two administrators and the 120 satraps don't. These men are determined that Daniel should not be promoted to highest position in the kingdom next to the king. They appear to have recruited a great deal of help, and they seem to have considered every move that they make very carefully. They misuse their authority without hesitation, pursuing their own goals rather than those which would be good for the kingdom or are preferred by the king. These men aren't interested in justice. They want Daniel dead, as becomes clear towards the end of the story. It would be easy to describe the opposition as being on the attack and Daniel as being on the defense. But the notion of attack and defense suggests preparedness. They have swords and we have shields. They have horsemen and we have walls. There are measures and there are countermeasures. But what we have here in Daniel chapter 6 is an ambush, a trap, a mugging. It was intended to be entirely one-sided. It is amazing that there are, in fact, two sides to this account. So let's begin this morning by looking at the trap that was set for Daniel. We're told that the opposition assembles for the first time and presents the king with its joint recommendation. The focus of worship for the next 30 days should be King Darius. All other religious practices should be suspended, and anyone who does not comply should be executed. We're not told in the account why King Darius agreed with this. Did he approve every unanimous recommendation that was presented to him by his civil service? Did he have a very poor opinion of the wooden idols commonly worshipped? Did he rate himself as no less significant than the other men who were worshipped as though gods? Whatever his reason, we're told that the law is enacted. The trap is set. What will Daniel do? The law instructs Daniel to stop worshipping God and to start worshipping the king. But Daniel declines to do either. Take a look at verses 10 and 11. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room, where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. It's clear that the opposition knew their man. They know whom he respects, and they know that he will not desist. It's an example of the way in which the testimony of an enemy can have greater weight than the testimony of a friend. As a result, they know what he will do and they know where to find him. I'm sure that Daniel recognized the danger he was in, but we do not see him here seeking advice or recruiting allies or contacting powerful friends. We do not see him here agonizing over the consequences of his decision or the unfairness of the predicament in which he's placed. We do not see him hide or run away. As had been his lifelong practice among the enemies of his people, he gave thanks to God and he asked for God's help. We're told that he prays frequently and regularly, but there's no indication here that under the pressures of the situation, he attempts to plead or bargain or cajole or somehow manipulate God to act in his favor. Daniel has been snared. The opposition assembles for the third time, and they present a little pantomime to the king, which is intended to conceal their delight. They ask if it is true that no one is permitted to worship any god or man other than King Darius during the period in question. And the king cheerfully confirms that it is. And then they confess that Daniel has been found breaking the law, which means he will have to be executed. It seems that the reaction of the king was not as easy for them to predict as the reaction of Daniel. The opposition reports Daniel's civil disobedience as a lack of respect for the king and a lack of respect for the law. These comments may have been intended to sweeten the pill by arousing the king's anger or suggesting that perhaps Daniel was not fit to hold high office given his evident disrespect. But it's also possible that the opposition doubted whether they would get the king's approval because they designed a trap that didn't require it. So, what will the king do in response to all this? The king had had no difficulty approving the proposal brought to him at the beginning of the account. But he also has no difficulty setting aside the apparent slur on his person and the slur on the law of the Medes and Persians. And he appears to have had no difficulty recognizing that this scheme is about to cost him his most excellent advisor. Take a look at verse 14. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort to save him. Unfortunately, it becomes apparent that the trap was too well designed, and this heir to Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom found that there was nothing he could do. Daniel is snared and the trap is sprung. The opposition assembles for a fourth time and press home their case. The king has evidently spent some time trying to find a way round or a way out or a way of escaping the consequences of this law. We've already seen back in verse 8, one of the characteristics of the law of the Medes and Persians is that it cannot be altered. Now, O king, issue the decree and put it in writing, so that it cannot be altered. But in addition, in the same verse, we discover that it's part of the characteristic of the laws of the Medes and Persians that they also cannot be repealed. They can't be undone. And here in verse 14, there seems to be a third characteristic. When the king heard this, he made every effort. And there's a little phrase there, until sundown, to save him. It suggests that there is an immediacy about the application of the law and the punishment of crime. The law of the Medes and Persians was time limited, and it had to be acted on. There was no possibility of postponing judgment and giving it thought over the following days and weeks, or indeed of simply suspending it so that it never found application. And in verse 15, we see them come back again when the time is up. They press home the fact that the law cannot be changed. They press home the fact that it has to find timely application, and they seem to press home the fact that no one is above the law. No decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. Lastly, we see that the king is obliged to apply the full force of his authority to ensure the application of the law. The king gave the order. Daniel was taken and thrown into the den. The king sealed the entrance with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. The trap was well designed. Daniel now is beyond human aid. But King Darius does one additional thing that his opponents, that Daniel's opponents, had not allowed for. He issued an appeal over the law of the Medes and the Persians. Take a look at verse 16. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." So the question arises, what will God do? The king appears to have derived little assurance from his prayer. Verse 18 tells us, the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him. And he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. He did not choose to forgo food, entertainment, and sleep voluntarily. This was no exercise in fasting. Nonetheless, there appears to have been spiritual benefit. Looking into Daniel's face the previous night, Darius had addressed his plea to the God whom you serve continually. But by the end of the night, the king is able to give Daniel a title and God a name. As he approaches the lion's den, in his urgency he calls out, "Daniel, servant of the living God, Has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? We don't know what had occupied Darius's thoughts that night. And we don't know how much he had recalled of what he had heard. It's possible that he was familiar with Jeremiah, the prophet who foretold the fall of Babylon, and had corresponded with the exiles from Judah. It's possible that he might have heard Daniel speak from his knowledge of God. But it doesn't matter whether Darius knew a little or a lot, because his understanding wasn't a factor in the events that unfolded. Daniel was rescued by the living God. The opponents of Daniel are dealt with summarily at the end of the story. Those who had injured the interests of king and state, abused the privileges of office, and conspired to murder an exemplary public servant are subjected themselves to the same trial he had undergone. The danger to which Daniel had been exposed was very real. They do not survive. And King Darius testifies to the nation. He is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. Verses 26 and 27. The king encourages his hearers to fear and reverence the living God who rescues and who saves. If this is not something you have ever done, there is an opportunity here to be seized with both hands. We may turn from the worship of men and of man-made gods to the worship of the living God. This was a part of the message that Paul and his helpers brought to Europe. Turn from these worthless things to the living God who made heaven and earth and sea and everything in them. Acts chapter 14. We may serve the living God once our consciences have been cleansed by that greater sacrifice for sin, which has been offered on our behalf by Jesus Christ. We may put our hope in the living God, who is the Saviour of all men, and especially of those who believe. Paul's letter to Timothy, chapter 4. And we may become sons of the living God. Romans chapter 9. King Darius testifies, he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. If this is something you would like to hear more about, then please get in touch with Michael Peach at Honor Oak Christian Fellowship Centre. We would be very glad to introduce you to the living God.